As mountain bikers, we're always optimising our ride, switching out grips, changing tyres, but there's one component that we might overlook, and that's the crank. Cranks, specifically crank length, makes a huge difference to the fit, feel and performance of your mountain bike, yet many of us stick with the stock length that comes on our bike. In recent times, racers and riders have been trying shorter and shorter cranks. So today, we're going to discuss all things crank length to find out if less is actually more. And this isn't just a theory exercise. No, we've got a set of 155mm cranks to try out too, to see if all the hype is worth it. Before we start switching components out, how did we end up here? Well, those early pioneers, the people that made what we now call mountain bikes, were really influenced by the road because that's where the cutting edge good technology was for components, for geometry, for frame materials and production. And lots of those ideas took decades to, become superseded by better off-road specific designs. One of the ideas that stuck around the longest was crank length, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So when those early pioneers, influenced by the road, as we've mentioned, were morphing clunkers into what we call mountain bikes, they had to use the road and touring cranks that were around, and they were only available in the 170 and 175 lengths. Up until recently, the big brands, the Shimanos, the SRAMs, were only offering a very limited size range from 165 up to 175. Things are changing and the status quo is changing too, with both SRAM and Shimano now offering much shorter cranks. SRAM now go down to 155 and Shimano have got cranks in certain models down to 160. But outside these two big brands, brands are really shrinking things down. Brands like Hope, like Pinned, like Appleman, all offering much shorter cranks. Hope have got a 155. Appleman go as low as 100mm. Now that is short. One thing that often comes up when talking about shorter cranks is how it can affect your leverage. And that, by logic, means that it's going to affect your power. But things aren't as straightforward as you might imagine. Longer cranks do give you more torque, but that's only half the equation for power. The other half, that's cadence. Whilst the extra leverage from the longer cranks can help with quick bursts of acceleration, the larger circle, the diameter where your foot and pedal have to rotate round, will mean that your cadence will be slower. Thus, the shorter cranks do give you less leverage, but the smaller circle of the outer diameter of where your pedal is does mean that your cadence will be faster for any given effort. These differences in leverage and cadence pretty much balance each other out, but don't take my word for it, there's been plenty of scientific studies to prove it. In this study, participants used 5 different crank lengths, ranging from 120mm all the way up to 220mm. The result? A difference in power of just 3.85% from the best to the worst. You might not be surprised to learn that the 120mm and 220mm cranks were the worst. But interestingly, the 145s have the highest power output. That said, the difference in power between the 145, 170 and 195mm wasn't significant, so we don't need to read into that too much. The only time that this really changes is on steeper climbs, when you're really having to try and put the power down. The drop in leverage and the drop in cadence means that, it can be harder work. The rough rule of thumb is that for every 10mm shorter in crank length you go, you need to make your chainring 2 teeth smaller. We've got one more thing to adjust before we head out onto the trails after we've fitted these new cranks, and that's adjusting the saddle height. We've got to adjust the saddle height because, the lowest point of where our leg will be is 15mm higher. So I often measure my saddle height from the centre of the bottom bracket to the top. But again, this new lowest point where the pedal is now up by 15mm. So we should lift our saddle by around 15mm. This can run into fit issues because even at the lowest point with a dropper post, it's going to be 15mm higher than it was before. Potentially, depending on frame design, it might allow you to actually get away with a slightly deeper drop post. So it's worth measuring up. Okay, greetings, welcome to a nice little journey on some beautiful trails. We've got some shorter length cranks. Yep, you can notice the difference at lower cadences. I feel like it's a little bit extra sort of like push that you've got to put in. I can actually feel my hips are a bit nicer. That seems ridiculous, but the range of motion isn't as big. Like the diameter that the pedals has got to loop through is much smaller. Right, ooh, now this looks more fun. This is a sort of lovely, engaging, steppy climb. Yeah, steppy stuff like this is always really fun. It's an engaging ride. So when you are tired, yeah, it's a bit more taxing. But it's engaging because with the traditional crank lengths that we've had, say with this little step here, I'd have to half pedal. Especially with flats, it was a bit awkward. You have to sort of gun a little bit of momentum to get over the crest, or at least up the edge, and then pedal again, because sort of you know that under the little bit of suspension compression and that rocky slab meeting your crank, there'd be a rather nasty scratching sound. So far so good on these short cranks. Not in the fittest form I've ever been, but the spinning to wind technique does feels quite nice. I am definitely noticing the ground clearance on the climbs. Okay, cranking along just there. I've got tired legs, but I couldn't feel that urgency that you get with a longer crank. Possibly the wrong tyres for today, but oh my goodness. Okay, that was a really good example. Really nice rain gully. And another one there where if I wasn't riding with my feet really level, and I would have, yeah, possibly twinged something. Oh, what a lovely trail. I think I can notice that my legs are a little bit closer together on stance lengths, I should say. And that's actually quite nice. I feel quite centered on the bike. Maybe I've got little legs. Maybe it helps. There's some hidden benefits to these shorter cranks which may not be obvious when you first look at them, and that's because they can help with knee and hip flexion. Simply put, this means that your knee and hip has to move a little bit less. Why? Well, because of the circle, the arc that the pedal makes as it spins round, it's smaller with a short crank. The range of motion is reduced, and that can help. Firstly, studies found that this reduced joint movement and muscular load reduced perceived fatigue during testing. Then we can look at our roadie friends again. Whilst they were wedded to those longer cranks, now there's been a short crank revolution. Tadej Pogačar, the phenomenon that he is running 165, and his arch nemesis, Jonas Vingegaard, went down and tried 155s before coming back to 165s. Now you might be wondering why they're using these really short cranks. Well, some of it's to do with the really aggressive position that they are on the bikes. They want to get as aerodynamic as possible, they want to get the front of their bike as low as possible, but maintaining that high seat angle to get the power and cadence correct. And that means that having this huge discrepancy between saddle height and bar height means it closes up the hip. Now, switching to these short cranks means it opens up this hip angle because it reduces the amount of flex that's needed, because the diameter of the circle, imagine the pedal axle spinning around, because of its shorter length on the crank, means it's much smaller, and that means it opens up those knees and hips. Whilst the aero gains might not mean much to us mountain bikers, if you're really into your gravel or your XC, it might help. But I think the bigger story here is that the roadies really care about ergonomics, and for them, these short cranks are a real advantage. Talking of hips and knees and changes that may affect them, there's another change, but it's not whilst you're pedalling. No, this one's to do with while you're rolling along. Everyone's got a favourite foot to put forward when they're riding, and well, changing crank length will change how this fit and feel occurs. We've done a video all about Q factor and stance width, so perhaps we could call this stance length. Effectively, by shortening where our pedal is relative to the bottom bracket, we're changing our stance. So whichever foot you put forward, both of them are going to narrow in with the shorter cranks. Obviously, if you've got longer cranks, it's wider. It's a little bit horses for courses. Some riders say that they prefer this more neutral, more centered position. Motocross riders have a similar one. Moto trials have a similar position. Others prefer the wider stance because it's more stable. Either way, it will be a difference that you can feel on the trail. It Might not be as big as some of the others, but it's worth considering. While some of the changes that you'll feel, or could feel, with these shorter cranks, one of them isn't that subtle. It's not nuanced. No, it's crank clearance. Whilst 5 or 10 or 15 mil might not sound that much, as you can see here, every little bit helps. If you've ever caught a pedal, either going up or, probably worse, heading down a trail, you'll know that it's not something to be sniffed at. Not just bent pins or a slightly mangled axle. It can really take you out. And that's where short cranks have a real big advantage, because they are that much shorter. They give you quite a lot more ground clearance at a really critical point. I'm not Chris Ackrig, but he is an incredible e-bike climber, and that's one thing that a lot of e-bikes can do, is climb really technical, tough terrain. But as these EMTBs are pedelecs, you've got to keep pedaling. So having a shorter crank and having more ground clearance can really help. Hope made 155 length cranks initially just for EMTBs, but then they realised there was demand for, well, other trail riders that enjoy technical climbing. Climbing with Coutts, the crank edition. Okay, so we're settling into a nice spin, and I guess with like every product that we experiment with and we try out, your body is going to be very used to a certain feeling. So sometimes maybe it's bar roll, maybe it's grips. You've got to do something that doesn't feel right to refine something that might be better. And with cranks, I've ridden 170 cranks, which for my height, I'm about 172 centimetres without shoes. It was on the short side. Now we've gone through this incredible crank revolution of much shorter cranks. The argument was still, I got told that I should try a longer crank for mountain biking because of the kind of extra leverage. But yeah, I think spinning along, I can feel over the 155s that, yeah, my hips, and I guess what I've got in my pocket, is having to do a bigger range of motion than it would have to do on those little cranks. Maybe there's an in-between size that would be perfect. But we're heading up to a steeper climb, and I think that's where, well, as the cadence slows, because I haven't got the gearing or the strength, because I'm not a main channel super horse, yeah, the extra leverage does come through on those kind of crux moves. I guess it's a bit like wheeling is a good example. If you can, or even if you can't wheelie, even if you try and lift the front up with a bit of pedal force over, say, a curb-sized object, that initial bit of force, that leverage from the longer crank, you can notice. Obviously, much like in riding a bike, wheeling lots of other aspects isn't just down to crank length. I'm not suggesting that you put 180s on to wheelie better, but it's just, you can notice the subtlety in the leverage. Oh goodness, getting back into the chunkier, more bits where I have to concentrate. This dappled light is lovely, hopefully coming through in Technicolor to you, because it's really rather gorgeous. Here's another point of crank clearance, not just overpasses, but narrower sections. Obviously my pedal's going to stick out the same on either crank, but they're, well, physically not going down as far. It does give us that extra clearance. Now the cadence has really slowed. I can feel the extra leverage. So I guess if you've got lots of steep stuff, it might be an advantage to the longer crank. Or maybe I just need lower gears, because if I had a lower gear, I'd be able to keep the cadence higher, which then means the leverage is less of an issue. I'd have the clearance, well, and I'd have a lower gear. Hopefully I'd be less worn out. Maybe that's a whole separate video. This sort of technical chop, really trying to concentrate on putting pressure, even pressure, through the bike, through the pedals. And through that, I'm really noticing that my, the stamp's length, so that's where my feet are, it is that much further out. I think, yeah, there is a stabilisation sort of advantage, or more positional advantage, I should say, to having the shorter stance length, effectively where my feet are. I think it's much nicer having them a bit close together. I never thought I'd want that, but it is actually quite nice on these downhills. Whilst we can thank the EMTBs for making these shorter cranks a little bit more mainstream, it's actually really cool to see this trend growing, and the two bigger players in the market, both SRAM and Shimano, are now, well, coming in with smaller than 165 cranks in lots of different ranges. We've talked about the physiological benefits, the ground clearance, the different stance length, and how it feels on the bike. So, is it the future? Well, I think for some riders who enjoy technical climbing, I think there's some definite clearance conundrums that can be solved with a shorter crank. They can be really good on those tech climbs. And actually, for those riders that really enjoy going long, the ergonomic benefits for lots of riders, not just XC racers, are out there too. Am I going to change all my cranks to shorter ones on all the different bikes I've got? Maybe not. It feels like quite a costly endeavour. And I think on some more niche bikes like single speeds, I think the extra leverage is a good thing. But on marathon XC, trail bikes, I'll definitely be looking at shorter cranks. Maybe if I'm lucky I can get one and switch it between them all. It's definitely something worth considering. Those are my thoughts. It's not conclusive, it's not scientific, it's just me riding around, enjoying myself on a bike, and those are my feelings. Obviously, how you ride and where you ride are going to be different. But that's a talking point, isn't it? Join me in the comments down below to let me know what you think. Are you going to switch to short cranks, or are you happy on longer 175mm? Let me know in the comments down below.